Buenos días a todos los presentes.
Good morning to all attendees. We start this second session of the seminar with regards the exhibition The Arts and Cultures of Al-Andalus, the Power of the Alhambra. We are going to start this session with Rafael López Guzmán, one of the three curators for this exhibition. Rafael is a chair of arts history in the University of Granada. He's a specialist in Islamic art of medieval times in Spain, and I believe his personal career, and especially during the last 15 years, he's been very much influential in terms of the exhibition contents and narrative of Islamic art in Spain. He was a commissaire, a curator for the exhibition of the Splendor of the Umayyads, another one on Ibn Khaldun, which highlighted not just the role of the Umayyads, but also marked the lines and the elements having to do with the Mediterranean Sea in the later medieval period. So I think the Rafael personality with Ibn Khaldun and the Umayyads have been two of his main highlights. But also I would like to highlight another one having to do with Silk Route and Samarkand. His work on Ruy González de Clavijo, who was one of the main characters, despite all the despite himself, as he used to say, it's one of the main characters of medieval narrative. Also, with regards the subject of Samarkand and the Mudéjar art. Excuse me, I was mixing up things. One of the two things, different things, were Samarkand and Mudéjar art in the Americas. I was saying Ruy González de Clavijo was a fundamental character because even if he traveled in the 15th century, his book was published by the end of the 16th century in 1866 with the big game in the subcontinent, Indian subcontinent. A British publisher found his book and found it was one of the few examples of Western narrative as referred to that region. The fact that Rafael has dedicated time to that in his work, I find it especially relevant. And the last subject I want to refer to, last element I want to refer to, is in fact all the issues having to do with Mudéjar art in Latin America. And I'm saying it from the point of view as my job as the head of Casa Árabe. I find this to be one of the subjects of this century, as countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc. are starting to make themselves apparent with their influence in Latin America. We're going to witness a recovery process of that past of the Mudéjar art in Latin America. So as a conclusion, we will be listening to someone who's been present at the main highlights of exhibitional culture. I believe there are not so many curriculums which can be make themselves so apparent in around these subjects. I've got to confess that both the issue of Samarkand and Latin American Mudéjar art is wonderful. Traveling through Iran and also traveling most of the Latin American continent, looking for Mudéjar remnants in Mexico, in the Andes in Mexico, is wonderful. I'm lucky to have developed my research around those two lines, enjoying myself and also focusing on scientific production. So in that sense, we're going to speak about the artistic relationships between the Nasrid Granada and the relationship with the Christian kingdoms. If we could switch off the lights, that would be wonderful, because I want to show a series of slides. The cultural relationships are one of the elements which should be dealt with when analyzing relationships between the Nasrid Sultanate and the Al-Andalus in general, and the Christian kingdoms. Should we use a chronology, some kind of chronology, we may say that between 1350 and 1460, the court of Nasrid power, we may see that in terms of our historic atlas, 85 years would be of peaceful coexistence, and 25% of the time in war. So we're talking about 85 years of permeable borders and mutual relationship. That doesn't mean that skirmish would happen in moments of peace, or also that during the war times there would be peaceful periods in between. This is significant because cultures usually make improvements during peace. If the history of mankind would have been a continuous stretch of wars, no improvements of culture would have been possible. That's important to be said, because historic atlas are usually referring to important feats marked by battles and war declarations. But that's not the true reality of history. History is made on peace periods. And that means relationships, establishment of relationships. In that sense, we've got to say that the transmission of culture in that Western Mediterranean space is going to be made through many different moments, and a territory which changes all throughout those 8 centuries of Islamic presence in the Iberian Peninsula, or the shaping of Islamic states, but it is not the same in time. So Toledo was conquered in 1185, so the period of presence of Toledo would be running from 711 to 1085. Excuse me, I said 1185 before. So from the very beginning, that the Umayyad Caliphate was founded in Cordoba, we're going to refer to feats and elements and lights happening in the Hispanic March, in Catalonia, in Toledo with Archbishop Raimundo, and the School of Translators of Toledo, for example, financed and founded by Alphonse X. That context, with such an intense exchange of culture, is going to find great value in language, in the languages spoken in the Iberian Peninsula of that time, be it Hebrew, Latin, Arabic, and also where Spanish, Castilian Spanish, is being born and being promoted by different kings. So there's no doubt that the language as an element for cultural unification is fundamental, and the recognition of each other's language is an important element for that exchange to take place. So when Alphonse X made the praise, the panegyric for the burial of his father, the languages used on it are Hebrew, Arabic, Spanish and Latin. The languages being used in the area of Seville. That means not an element of conquest, but the show of the respect. With the Spanish we speak today, we are using about 2,500 words coming from Arabic, excluding the names of places, something which is not exactly the case for the rest of the languages in the Iberian Peninsula, spoken in the Iberian Peninsula, it would only be the case of Portuguese. And that idea of using the language as an element for the transmission of power can be found in other elements, objects, artifacts, artistic artifacts, where such characteristics can be found. You will find in the exhibition works, whenever I refer to the exhibition, I'll be referring to artifacts there. So these are to be the presumed keys given to Ferdinand III when he entered Seville. So Castilian Spanish, despite the interest of Alphonse X for different languages in the coexisting in the Iberian Peninsula, he is going to directly promote Castilian Spanish. He's going to turn it into a cultivated language. So his general history or his history of Spain is going to be written in Spanish. But the language is a very important element for cultural transfer and the respect and knowledge of other languages. We know, for example, that Alphonse X spoke Arabic, so the recognition of other languages would involve a cultural recognition, a cultural respect towards other languages. And at that very moment of the lower medieval ages, where there are a series of borders between the Al-Andalus and Christian kingdoms, there are also violent clashes. There are mobs of both Christians and Arab soldiers which fight under the same flag. The Nasrid army supported Ferdinand III when Seville was conquered, and in the text of Alphonse X we may find these pictures of this kind, with an army made up of both Christian and Muslim warriors. That doesn't mean that we won't find the same kind of groups of soldiers fighting each other. So we will find there's proof of the existence of mercenaries of the different religions which will fight for lords of a different religion. Don Alonso Pérez de Guzmán, the famous Guzmán el Bueno, the one who threw his stag so his child would be killed by the troops laying siege to Tarifa. He was a mercenary himself. He led an army in the Moroccan territories. He would be a very well paid general. And in a moment where Sancho, the son of Alphonse X, when he rebelled, Guzmán el Bueno would facilitate the entry of a Maronid army in the peninsula in order to help Alphonse X. So borders are very permeable, especially considering the way in which war was led at that time. It is only when the holy wars were declared, the armies, the Christian armies in the Islamic kingdoms would be left to play a secondary role, so no direct confrontation would take place. The idea of the coexistence of cultures will be promoted after the conquest of Toledo, because there we will find that both Jews, Christians and Muslims would live together. But Christians of two kinds. On the one side, the Mozarabs, who lived for centuries under the Arabs, who speak Arabic, who eat and prepare dishes with an Islamic character, who dress like Arabs, even if they are still Christians, would give us an idea that how it is an Islamic culture, but not just in the religious sense. The older Christians are in Toledo are the Mozarabs, not the Franks or the northern Christians, and also they would coexist with Jews living in Toledo. Even if we refer to that possibility of mudeharization, those cultural exchanges, we find that easy conversions will take place in this under this situation of tolerance, of mutual tolerance, before the Almohads and the Almoravids arrived, because a certain economic situation was being sought, because Muslims would take up the Christian religions, but also the elites in society, through the influence of the Mozarabs, that the shifting of religions is not that complicated. In fact, there's an episode, an event which is not that very known. Alphonse VI had different wives, and the last one was called Zaida, who was the daughter-in-law of Al-Mutamed, the king of Seville. And they had a child, Sancho Alfonso, who was the heir of the crown of Castile. If it was not for the Battle of Uclés, where this prince was dead, we would have had a Spanish king who would be the son of a Muslim prince. So it's an important element of those cultures which we today consider to be deprived of communicating vessels when it is clear that they had them. This is document from the Taifa of Badajoz, where we can see Alphonse VI. These ideas of cultural transfer between the different communities, when religion is no ditch, no gap which cannot be surpassed, leads us on to talking about characters. For example, Saint Casilda, who was the child of Al-Mamun, one of the last sultans of Toledo, and she would be a very charitable person, giving alms to prisoners. And there's also the legend of how the bread given by her would turn into flowers. Similar legends can be found in the stories of other saints. She would go to, after being falling ill, would go to Castile, would heal and turn Christian and become one of the saints of those times. So we're talking not just about economic reasons, or because, for example, the lower social classes need to frame themselves in a certain economic environment in order to survive, but also we will find transfer systems, religious transfer systems in the upper classes, where Mudehars, Mozarabs, Jews and Christians coexist. So with regards to the Mudehar world, the language Arabic is not a sign of a religion but of a culture, and we see a series of manuscripts describing Christians, fully Christian concepts of the world, but expressed in Arabic. That idea for me is a very interesting one. If we've got to cover the issue of cultural relationships between the north and the south, between the Al-Andalus and the Christian territories, which are shaping new states in the northern half of the peninsula. In fact, the Al-Andalus is a myth for northern Spanish societies. Not much information reaches the north. Some merchants, diplomats, ambassadors, some visits sent by a king in the north who's got to know Cordoba, Seville, Granada or Toledo, and who would come back telling stories about the very large cities with large monuments and buildings. But I insist, they stay as myths in the minds of the northern Spaniards. Myths which will become more real as the conquest makes progresses onto the south. So that admiration for the cities in the south will be supported on a series of elements and questions. For example, such as when Alphonse the X ordered the Cordoban Mudehars two restoration works of the mosque in Cordoba. Maria Jesus Viguera was referred to that time when Charles V traveled from Granada to Cordoba and got to know about the will of some noble persons and higher priests of Cordoba who wanted to put down the mosque in Cordoba. But Charles V was not a radical monarch. So it is thanks to him that we can enjoy Cordoba's mosque today. And that sense, that feeling of respect by the Christian Castilian kings towards the southern culture can be understood, for example, when Cordoba is laid siege by Ferdinand III, and the Cordobans menace with destroying Cordoba and killing themselves if they are not let to flee the city with their own possessions. The Latin chronicle of the kings of Castile says that the Cordobans said that they would destroy everything of value in the city. The breach, the mosque, they would hide the gold and silver, they would burn Syrian clothes, and they would kill themselves. That the menace given by the Cordobans when Ferdinand III is laying siege to the city. And when the city is conquered, Ferdinand III enters the palace of the rulers of Cordoba, and it is said he entered the most noble palace prepared to themselves by the Moorish kings, which had been known by the chronicles of others. So it speaks about the myth in Castile, in the north, on Cordoban palaces. And they highlight that in fact, that was incredible, or had been told to them to be incredible, was even more incredible than that. And as Castilian noblemen enter the city of Cordoba and take possession of the palaces, say the same. The walls are decorated with beautiful towers. The houses have carved wood ceilings, and it's an orderly city. And these would tell us a lot about the Islamic urban planning and that theory of the random urban planning of Islamic cities in the medieval times. So I think it's something to be questioned. So what is it that people, for example, in Aragon would know about those exchanges from the between the sultanates of the south and the north? There was there was trade of goods coming from Seville, Cordoba, Granada, cities where artisans were specialized in ivory, wooden objects, jewelry, etc., which would tell things about the culture. Well, one of the most sought elements would be textile clothes, which would be manufactured not just in the Al-Andalus, but also coming from the Far East. And Jewish and Mozarab merchants will trade with these elements and artifacts, which could be found at that time in the markets. The fact that a rich lady of Toledo or in northern Spain would dress herself with clothes from Granada and Seville, so fashion wouldn't come from Paris at that time. We may find in the monastery of Las Huelgas in Burgos most noblemen and kings of Castile would be buried with the best clothes. They were wearing the best clothes for the burial, so we can have a series of elements from those burials. We've got references to, for example, Allah in that piece of clothing put in a tomb, or maybe these from Leonor of Castile, or some we have, such as, for example, this beautiful piece of silk, which is just the lining of the coffin of Leonor of England. So it tells us how these kings will try to have artifacts from the Al-Andalus the moment they would be put to rest. The recognition of Al-Andalus textiles, which is so important, which are so important as luxury elements, is also, or finds also proof in the drawings of the chant of Saint Maria, the Cantigas de Santa Maria, commended by Alfonso X, where there's a series of problems or events are described, and in the end the Virgin helps the sinners or Christians and help them to solve such problem. But what's important in an image like this, in this kind of cartoon, is that the person who's been dead is in a bed covered with a piece of cloth of bed clothing, which has got Arabic inscriptions. So it refers to luxurious elements and textiles and silks, which are sometimes have their source or the origin in the more the farthest parts of the Mediterranean or the East. These are Dalmatian of Bishop Rodrigo Jiménez de Rada, a bishop who fought at the Battle of the Navas de Tolosa, but when he was buried, he used clothes manufactured in Al-Andalus with Arabic writings. This speaks about a recognition, a respect towards a different culture. These raincoats of the great General of Castile also includes the inscription of glory to our Lord the Sultan. So probably this was a piece of cloth being manufactured at the royal workshops of the Sultan. The exhibition, The Arts and Cultures of Al-Andalus, the Power of the Alhambra, is made up of very rich and interesting textile elements. For example, from the Lázaro Galdiano Museum, the Museum of Beautiful Art, speaking about geometric, epigraphic vegetable elements, these clothes of musicians, or these pieces of clothes with where there's a clear intention to decorate, and which allow for us to do cross-sectional understandings or interpretations. We have gazelles on top, or coats of arms, or maybe this piece of clothes, which is not a piece of clothes which is not in the exhibition, of the Dance of the Swords, a game which became popular in the Al-Andalus, but which also reached the north, and which became so fashionable in Castile and Aragon that we believe that maybe some artifacts, some elements would be made in the Al-Andalus just for export, not for being sold in the markets of Granada and Seville. These sword games clothes, which were being better sold in the world of Castile. Another element I'm going to show you with 3 examples of manufactures reaching the kingdoms of the north will be the golden pottery, the gilded pottery. Elements we know through the famous vases of the Alhambra. The technique of that metallic, the luster pottery, it comes from Iraq, Iran, would enter the peninsula, going through Egypt and reaching up to Granada, and Granada turned into a very important manufacturing center. This pottery, which will become a very valued, a very precious commodity, and it would be Catalonian and Portuguese merchants who will sell these artifacts even up to Russia or England or the Scandinavian countries. So we're speaking about a kind of of pieces that coming from the easternmost part of the Mediterranean will be then very influential on the artisans and the works of Grenadinian artisans, and also take into account that the harbors and markets of the Eastern Islam would be the core points for that export. Also, for example, these pottery will be very much influential in eastern Spain, and the Crown of Aragon, for example, showed great interest for this kind of pottery because of the profit which could be made, the profits which could be made out of these artifacts. So they produce this kind of ceramics, changing, for example, the iconographic elements, even if they would keep Islamic elements. For example, you've got Fatma's hand there and the keys. Even if they wouldn't dare manufacture the larger pieces, such as, for example, the vases, which are manufactured both in Granada and Malaga. At that time, these works were referred to as Malik's works, that is, works made in Malaga, because it was the harbor from which they were exported.
We have many documents of this type of trade of luster pieces throughout the Mediterranean. We have we do not have the specific pieces that are reflected in those documents, but these two pieces coming from the Church of Sicilia. It is the Church of the Madonna del Paradiso di Mazara del Vallo di Sicilia. One of them in the Museum of Palermo, and the other one is the Institute of Valencia de Don Juan in Madrid. Well, we see that they show the great respect and interest that existed with regards to these kind of luxury artifacts. Another type of manufactured products that was important in the exchanges with the Christian kingdoms was wooden articles. Yesterday it was already mentioned with regards to Alphonse X, and we referred to the interest to chess, and this is a game coming from the east, but it was also very popular in Al-Andalus, and it was also a game of interest in also Castilla and the other kingdoms in Europe. We see in Alphonse X's book, we see the games between Christians and Muslims, and we also saw yesterday some images of women playing chess. We even know that Al-Mutamid, this poet king of Seville, had a very important collection of chessboards. Chessboards also became luxury objects with these squares of different colors. Sometimes they were inlay chessboards, and we also see that there were ivory pieces, wooden pieces, or bone pieces to create the different elements of the game, of the chess set. They were very important and luxury objects, and we even see some situations where in other cultures, more to the north, like France, we also find this same concept of two ladies playing chess. This is pieces in the Lázaro Ganciano Foundation in Madrid. There are also many other elements made out of wood that show the respect and acknowledgement towards the other culture, from the Christian world towards the Muslim world and the Kingdom of Granada. There were two staffs of the Cisneros General, one of them from Granada, the other one coming from northern Africa, when General Cisneros tried to conquer Northern Africa, and there we see that this Nasrid stuff, and we see the famous sentence, "God only is victor," and this again shows the cultural respect that existed, also the acknowledgement of the artistic value of this piece, in spite of the battles and the military actions against cities. But it was an acknowledgement of what was being done in in Granada. Here we have another example, an inlay piece, an inlay box, and they were used by ladies. And they are kept nowadays in museums and other centers, and these pieces all come from Granada. Here we have in the exhibition a very interesting example of these pieces that were in fact exchanged between the Al-Andalus kingdoms and the kingdoms in the northern part of the peninsula. There was a workshop in the Umayyad Cordova, and then this was later expanded to other areas, and here we see the use of ivory plates, also using epigraphic elements, atauriki, this lattice work, and also drawings or perhaps the representation of birds or all other types of animals. Ivory pieces are very important in terms of artistic work or an exceptional piece, and this means that many of these boxes, this one is extraordinary. Here you can see the interior in the exhibition. You'll find it too, but it's closed. And you see that the piece on the right goes exactly into the piece on the left, and there's a small doorway to it. So this was a wonderful concept. It was very original and very strange for the culture where they were produced. And many of these boxes were in fact preserved because they were used in cathedrals as boxes, as reliquaries. They were used to keep something that was already holy, and this is why these kind of objects were used as boxes, although we may find later some elements that may be Islamic and religious, but they are kept in the Christian cathedrals. So this is not a strange situation. In the 16th century, in the real chapel of Granada, for example, when all the reliquaries coming from Elizabeth the Catholic, they classified all these different reliquaries, and they bought an amban box in Lisbon, so a box coming from Japan, and the idea was to keep all those all those holy objects within that box. So they didn't look for an inlay box. They were looking for something exotic, something different, and that was the idea, to have something like that to keep these relics or this very holy objects. So we find that also in Al-Andalus, many objects that were manufactured in ivory and then were passed on to the Christian kingdoms. So we also find this kind of influence in a different kind of aspect, and that is the diplomatic relations and the exchanges that take place when the ambassadors are presented or when there are peace treaties signed. And in the exhibition you will also find several documents coming from the archive of the Crown of Aragon, and here we see documents that are, for example, peace treaties with Aragon, for example, or documents related to the presentation of ambassadors, so documents related to a direct relation between the members of the different courts, and there were usually some presents or gifts that accompanied those moments. During those diplomatic representations, so these diplomatic relations, there was always some kind of ceremonial presentation of the governors. When Muhammad I created the Sultanate of Granada, the Nasrid Sultanate, when there was the Arjona revolt, we see that Ferdinand III agreed with that. This was possible because the Sultan paid taxes to the Christian kingdom. So there is a relationship between Castilla and Granada. When Castilla was very weak, Granada didn't pay any taxes, but when Castilla was stronger, then Granada had to pay taxes. And sometimes the inhabitants of Granada went against the many needs, and sometimes they got support from them. So this was a very changing relationship. In one of the peace treaties between Yusuf IV and Juan II, we see that Juan II recommends the Sultan to the following. He says that he expects from them the traditional loyalty to the King of Castilla, the devolution of the captives, and the payment of taxes, and also the attendance to the courts. So the Sultan could go to the courts of Castilla with just as another courtesan, with the possibility to vote and give his opinion. So this is an acknowledgement, a specific acknowledgement of the level of the Sultan. So this means, here we understand that the kings of Castilla have their own coat of arms with this strip, and taking into account this quality of a noble person of Castilla, we can understand this kind of representations, like the one of the coat of arms with this strip, and we see that again in the Sultan's coat of arms. Here we have an example in a tile in the lower part of the Peinador de la Reina building here in the Alhambra, and here we see Islamic topics, but also if we look at this detail, here we see this coat of arms with the strip held by two people. This is a typical representation of Castile and Aragon, and this is exceptional because we even see the crown, a royal crown on top of the coat of arms. So we see this mixture of Castilian tradition, Gothic tradition, and see another example of this gilded ceramic kept in New York, where we see Saint George and the Dragon, which is something that has nothing to do with the Islamic culture. This piece is kept in the Metropolitan Museum. So this is linked to the books on these representations of the lives, the life in the court, and this we can see on the paintings too. Never mind whether the painters were from Seville or Islamic, but here we see that these paintings are situated in the Kingdom's Hall of Muhammad V here in the Alhambra. So here we are see a clear acknowledgement of the value of the other courts. And there's an exchange of diplomats too, and there's an exchange of structures, ambassadors, peace treaties, treaties in order to fight a common enemy or any other kind of elements and documents. Many of these documents have been included in the exhibition, and these documents have been borrowed from the archive of the Crown of Aragon. And then there's always the gift given in order to create a good atmosphere for meetings where policies were going to be discussed. And those gifts are not always well received or positively received. For example, we've already referred to the Abd Allah Memories, this 11th century book, where Abdallah tells about his relationships with Alphonse VI, and there's a razzia that is carried out in the southern area of the peninsula, going to Pinos Puente and nearly Granada too, and at a certain point he's negotiating about the payment of taxes, and there's a very beautiful text here, and there's a comment about the gift, and Abdallah says the following: furthermore, in order to take this evil away from me, I prepared several tapestries, fabrics and vases, and I prepared everything in a great tent where I invited him to come. So he invited the king to come into the tent. When he saw the fabrics, he looked at them without interest. Finally, we agreed that I would add 5,000 meticals in order to sum up to 30,000. So when Alphonse VI didn't accept the presents and gifts, then Abdallah accepted to pay 30,000. Also, he was trying to pay only 25,000. And then Abdallah said, as the king didn't want the gifts, I was happy to pay the amount of money and keep the gifts that were more expensive. Here we have another case of an ambassador. There were two of them that coincide. Here we had Othon, who wanted to start being recognized, acknowledged as the leader or the emperor, and this was something that was not so easy. And the gifts arrived first, and then it was the ambassador who arrived later. So depending on the gifts, the king would decide when to see the ambassador. Othon wanted to take the gifts personally, and the situation was such that a second ambassador had to come from Germany to give the gifts first and then obtain an appointment. Abderrahman III had received a medicine treatise, and of course the gift would change the relationship between the ambassadors and had an impact on the political relations between the north and the south. Muhammad IX sent an ambassador looking for the support of Mamelukes against Castile, who was still advancing. And the ambassador took with him several fabrics and ceramics, luster ceramics and normal earthenware, because the earthenware jars were very famous, the ones coming from Granada. They were very well known because of the smell they gave to the water that was kept in those jars. So there are even texts explaining how these earthenware jars are prepared and how they can get an artistic impact with such normal or basic material. So we see the acknowledgement of the gift in this ambassador visits, not very with gifts that are not very expensive, but they are perceived as an extraordinary gift in a different court. In this case, there were also gilded ceramics. For example, this vase, which is kept in Stockholm, refers to this idea of extraordinary elements, because tradition tells us that this vase coming from Granada or from Malaga was present during the weddings when Jesus transformed water into wine. But the myth, the legend, does refer to this idea of extraordinary elements. These objects are therefore representing elements that identify a specific culture. The gift is not chosen because of its value, but because it is an extraordinary object in the place where we are taking that gift. It is a gift that will represent the identity of the culture of the ambassador. So this is why these gifts are really important in those diplomatic relations between the different kingdoms. Another example, the ambassador Egypt sent an ambassador to Alphonse X in Seville, and in that case the gift was a crocodile alive. A crocodile from the Nile alive, and when the crocodile died, it was dissected and kept, and it was placed in the courtyard of the orange trees, which is the courtyard of the Mosque of Seville that had been turned into the cathedral. And this area is called the room of the lizard, and there was a moment when it was in bad condition and it was then thrown away, and a copy was reproduced in wood. Ibn Khaldun, before the conquest of Seville, we see that Ibn Khaldun was an ambassador in several courts, also for Muhammad V, and when he goes to Peter I, representing Muhammad V, and coming from Granada, he takes a gift for him. So Muhammad V was sending a gift to Peter I, and this gift was composed of silk fabrics and pure blood horses with saddles and bridles decorated with gold. Khaldun is invited to work as a counselor and to keep the lands of the family of Peter I, because there was this memory of who had been who had been the important families in the area, and it was in fact the areas and the properties that belonged to the family of Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun says no, and he goes back to Granada, and he says, there was living, he gave me a horse and food, and he gave me another gift for the Sultan of Granada. It was a mule with saddle and bridle decorated with gold. So we see that these gifts represent the acknowledgement of the other culture and also the communication between the two cultures. As I was saying at the beginning of my presentation, in this conquest of southern territories, when little by little the big cities in the south are conquered and the Christians acknowledge the assets they find there, they reuse the architecture, they find them, they turn mosques into cathedrals, minarets into towers for the cathedrals, and the new architecture of the Christians accompanies this. The tower, the old minaret of the of Seville's mosque becomes a bell tower of the cathedral, and we see even mudéjar churches that are built copying reference elements like arches or different decorative elements, battlements from the Muslim minarets. And therefore there's a new definition of these towers, but they become a new referential element of this mudéjar art. One of the elements with the greatest success of these exchanges of culture, and here I'm talking about the architecture of the end of the Middle Ages. Here we're talking about the chapels used for the tombs of monarchs. There's the Royal Chapel in Córdoba next to the Villaviciosa Chapel, and here we're talking about the section which is beginning the expansion by Muhammad II, and here we have the same type of arches with honeycomb vaults, with also decoration in Ataurik, gypsum elements, and many other Islamic decorative elements. So in this royal chapel within the Córdoba mosque is where Alphonse the 11th is buried. So at that time it had already been turned into the Cathedral of Córdoba, and this led to this model being copied in many other cathedrals and churches in Spain. Here we have another example from Seville, where Mr. Felipe, the prince who was the son of Ferdinand III, was going to be buried. So we have these chapels with these Islamic vaults, and little by little they lost their historical memory about their origin, about how they were built, and in the end they stopped being burial areas and they became chapels linked to local associations. And nowadays these are referred to those chapels used by the associations that prepare the processions for the Holy Week. So we are talking about elements that are in fact reaching the Christian culture. And in this sense, these elements are not limited to objects, but also we are talking about architecture, and these elements are all accepted and taken by the Christian culture, because also within the Christian culture there are several cultures that are evolving. But all this trend, in 1492 we see a radical change, but at that time all these Islamic elements had already been introduced into the Christian cultures of the north, and at that point we can talk about a common or combined cultures where those elements coming from the Islamic world already are part of this new identity, the modern Spain, which is not the Middle Ages culture anymore, but where the influence of the Islamic culture, of the Al-Andalus culture, of the culture of Granada started being part of our identity, and that is still the case today. Thank you very much.